What I love the most about the folklore is it's not new. These are gems that have been passed down for generations. And it doesn't matter how rich it is or how old, air quotes, it's relevant to date.
This is the Moreish Podcast, where Caribbean history meets culture and cuisine. Good morning, Kesha. How are you?
I am doing well. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so excited to talk to you face to face. We've been conversing for a little while over email because I have been enjoying your videos. So I wanted to have you on to talk about something that is sort of a commonality amongst all Caribbean countries. But before we dive right into our topic, why don't you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Kesha Christie, and I am a storyteller. I have a way with words, is what I've always been told, but very shy. I was afraid to speak in public, and I thought, let me fix that. And so I started working on my public speaking skills, and someone asked me to tell a folk tale. And I was like, folk tales? That's my life. And I told the story, but it was very different than my other connections, like motivational speaking and stuff like that. The connection with the audience was just something that I was like, oh, and I'm tingling. And ever since then, I was like, I'm a storyteller. And someone called my bluff and said, oh, yeah, well, come and tell a story in front of like 300 people. Okay. And I had to figure it out real quick. So I relied on the things that I knew, the things that I loved. Miss Lou, I dressed the part, I acted the part, I danced the part. And when I told that story, I was like, wow, there's a magic here. And it's just like, we hear about the magic that stories have. But this was a whole experience. And I was like, everyone needs this. And so I've been telling stories for 9 years now, almost. Yeah.
Wow. You hold events in and around the city. You do live storytelling. You have a podcast that you're reviving. So you do audio storytelling. Where are you located?
I'm in Toronto. I'm in Ajax, so about half an hour east.
And so most of your events happen in sort of the GTA.
Yes.
Yes. What is your Caribbean connection?
It's not obvious. I'm Jamaican, born in Canada, Jamaican heritage. It's like my parents always said, whether it doesn't matter whose house I was in, Canada's outside. When you're here, this is Jamaica. So that's where it went.
So you grew up, much like I did, born in Canada, in a Trinidadian family, Indo-Caribbean family, and inside the house is different than outside the house. Yes, we have that's a commonality in amongst a lot of the people that I speak with. And so, I think we have a slightly different experience than people who were born and raised or lived a long time of their life in the different Caribbean countries. One of the things that was pervasive throughout my childhood, and I imagine yours too, is storytelling, and specifically folklore.
Absolutely.
It is just the stories that we hear and that we grow up knowing and understanding and being a part of the culture. What is folklore?
Folklore is the creative way that we give ourselves to our culture, to our people. We share lessons, we share valuable lessons, we share our traditions, our beliefs. All of that is passed down in these neatly wrapped stories where they just have a little bit of magic in each time they're told. There's a story for almost every experience there is known to man. And in our family's stories were what guided us. If my mother didn't want me to go somewhere, I heard about, the Dwayne or, and it's like, oh, well, I'm not going out at night if that's going to happen. There were stories about Anansi, how, that resilience, that spark, the love of nature. We talk now, a lot of the things that we're talking about now, affirmations and, meditation, being close to nature, all of these things were dazzled and drizzled in every story that has been told. What I love the most about the folklore is it's not new. These are gems that have been passed down for generations, and it doesn't matter how rich it is or how old, air quotes, it's relevant today. Every time you
Yeah.
hear it, it's relevant today. And I'm blown away how, when I get introduced to stories or when I'm sharing stories, they take a life on their own. But when they take on that life, it's like relevant in this very moment. Something that might have happened 5 seconds ago just comes out in the story. And I'm like,
Mhm.
this is awesome.
It is a little bit of maybe a little bit of truth, a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of lesson, sort of all balled into a story that's easy for a child to understand, easy for adults to understand.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, these are the stories that when we're told as children, when we're told these stories as children, we learn our social behaviors from these stories. Being kind, being gracious, sharing. These are all things that are woven into these stories. You didn't realize them because you were so attached to the character. But when you have a real life situation, you remember that character experience, and then here you are.
Mhm. Some of these tales are a little bit scary. My uncle was convinced or would portray himself to be very convinced that there was a Lagahoo living in the neighborhood. And he would tell the story all the time, and as a kid I would ask him to tell it all the time because it was fun, it was funny, but also a little bit scary. And we'll get into what a Lagahoo is. But I want to mention that we're going to be focusing on the Caribbean in this conversation, but folklore exists in many different cultures.
Every culture.
So let's dive into folklore in the Caribbean and how it sort of is a part of daily life, or is it a part of daily life?
It's absolutely a part of daily life. It's in our music, it's in the culture, the way we speak, that rhythm of life. Folklore is that the roots, the foundation of everything that we're doing today.
Yeah. And it doesn't come out as, okay, so now I'm going to tell you a story. It is just integrated and interwoven.
Yes. Yes. It's that the string that connects us. Like the world, we're all connected in different ways, but there's that thread that literally connects us all, and it's our folklore. It's that underlying knowing that connects us in every situation.
Yeah. Where does it come from for us in the Caribbean?
Well, we know predominantly that a lot of the stories that we hear, especially in Afro Caribbean heritage, the stories originated in Africa and were brought with the people. They were the stories that provide nourishment and encouragement. But there was a whole section of time where slavery was abolished, as much as we understand it to be. But then there were indentured servants that came from around the world, from India, from Germany, and Ireland, that came to the Caribbean and landed in different places. Plus, there's the influence of the colonizers that resonated on the islands. So our stories that had this one form of richness ended up being dazzled with all this different influence. And with that, we were able to take on characters or change places that were more Caribbean in nature. Our characters took on a different shape and form. When you listen to some of the stories, my favorite type of storytelling is when one teller tells one story as they know it, and then everyone else tells their version, and it's just you're just like, whoa! And it's the same story, but it's got this zhuzh, this sweetness. It's almost like soup. You have your basics, and then somebody's gonna say, no, 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 you need to put in a little chocho. No, 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 you need to throw in a yam, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And when you're done, you're like, oh, that's good.
I love that so much because listening to somebody tell the story,
Mhm.
add their enthusiasm or their spookiness, oof, it's fantastic. It's fantastic.
Tingles.
Tingles. Is there any folklore that still exists in the Caribbean that stems from the indigenous cultures?
Oh yeah, a lot of the stories that we hear now that talk about having a closeness with nature, or anything that's, talking about spirits that are given rain or fire as a name or a characteristic. That is where you'll find the Indigenous lifelines coming through the folklore, because that was having that spirituality, having that respect for the environment and how we connect to it, is the underlying theme of what the Indigenous people wanted us to know and still want us to embrace and respect.
Yeah. Would you say that depending on, so you were saying that the enslaved Africans brought over the stories from wherever they came from, and that's where a lot of it stemmed from. Also, the indentured servants and anybody else who had influence into what the culture is like today in the Caribbean. Do you think that they all intermingled, and so in one story you might find tidbits from each culture, or are they still separate?
No, that separation does not exist. I mean, certain places you go, like the stories that are told in Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname, are mostly Hindu based. Like they're characters that
Yeah.
are based in there, but they mingle. Like people travel, and when they travel, they carry their stories, and when they share their stories, then someone else needs to tell or retell the story, and so it's a beautiful thing in that it becomes something new. And
Mhm.
for a storyteller, when you have a story or you meet a story that sticks, you have to make that story your own. So when it's retold with that main underlying meaning and expression, but then you're adding your own experience, you're adding your own environment. So the stories are no longer separate. And when you go from island to island, the stories still have that thread that connect us all. So I wouldn't say that they're separate at all.
They're all intermingled, much like the culture, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it absolutely is. As I was researching and getting ready for our conversation today, one of the things I was reading said that really the folklore that we hear in the Caribbean is different, even though it stems from whether it's India or the British or Africa. The version that we're telling now, somebody in, let me just say, somewhere in Africa would not really understand the version because it's been so changed. And it was referred to as the creolization of the folklore and the stories. Would you say that do you think that is a correct assumption or a correct way of speaking about it?
The way we tell stories in the Caribbean is very different than the way stories are told in other countries. And
Yeah.
so their settings are different. The way that they tell, the music that's that the rhythm that the story is given is different, but it's that rhythm, it's still stemming. Like the drum will be used just a little bit differently, but it carries that story it carries that story. It triggers your emotions differently, but it's the
Mhm.
same emotion. So it's still that value, it's still that richness. It's just a different, tell the story during the day, tell a duppy story during the day, meh, tell the story a duppy story at night now.
Oof.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we've been talking in generalities, storytelling, folklore, where it comes from, the history of it. Let's get down into like the nitty-gritty and share some of these tales and some of these characters. Is there any character, story, folklore that you will find in every single Caribbean country?
For me, I would say the trickster character.
Mhm.
Now, and a lot of the islands, when you walk anywhere and you say Anansi, everybody knows. But Anansi takes on so many different names depending which island you go to. So some of the
Mhm.
time, you might say Aunt Nancy, you might say Bernancy, you might say something a little bit different, and but everyone kind of grasps and knows you're telling a trickster tale. But there are also other trickster characters like Compre Lapin, um, whether you're in St. Lucia, you've got the French speaking islands, but that's a trickster character, so you grab on quickly. And so the theme of the character, that trickster archetype, is in every island. In Trinidad, you'll see monkey tales are the trickster stories. So that archetype is everywhere. The way the stories are told, a little bit different. But what I've noticed recently is that a lot of the stories share those characters are now combined in stories. Like now I'm seeing stories where Anansi and Monkey are integrated in the story. So now you've got two trickster archetypes in the
Mhm.
same story. And so it's like you're looking at that, and even though it's there may be different animal characteristics, they're the same archetype.
Interesting. That's interesting. A spider and monkey now becoming this essentially the same story. I referenced Lagahoo earlier in this conversation because it's one that I grew up with. Let's
Mhm.
talk about that one as an example. What is a Lagahoo?
A shapeshifter.
Mm,
So the story of Lagahoo is really, it could be anybody. Predominantly, you find that this character is a woman, an older woman who during the day lives alone, does her own everything by herself, but at nighttime just becomes something different. And these are the stories that are told to keep you in your house. But when we say shapeshifter and we look at the media and what we're seeing today, hi, we're seeing shapeshifters all the time in our science fiction stuff. A
yeah.
lot of the I want to say horror as a genre, they're take a new form, and it's like, listen, you guys weren't the first to do that, but it's interesting to see how they're taking that once historical person, that historical gem that we carried from generation to generation, and making it widestream for today.
Yeah. The shapeshifter, right? And I love the way you described it is like this person who every single day is your neighbor, is the woman down the street, is somebody you might see at the market. But at nighttime, they shift into an animal.
It could be another person. So it keeps evolving. So
Yeah.
back when we were first sharing these stories generations ago, the shapeshifter would become an animal. But now the shapeshifter, depending on who's telling the story, becomes another person. They have the same voice as your great 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 grandmother, and they look the same, and then they lure you in. So it's
Yeah.
all about that lure and how to get you.
And this one is a scary story, right? Because when they're shifting, it's for wickedness. They're not shifting to come tuck you in bed at night.
No, absolutely not.
Where does that particular story come from?
So that story, you'll find a lot of stories about the Lago in Trinidad
Mhm.
and Guyana, even Suriname. That's where those stories, you'll find a lot of them in their original, I would say original, but
Yeah.
un media tainted form.
Yeah. And is that a an African origin, indigenous origin, Indian
It's
origin? Do we know?
it's an Indian origin.
It is an Indian origin. Gosh,
Yes.
I would love to dig back and find out what the original story was.
I'm still looking for it. When I find it, I'll let you know.
And the other one that I grew up with is the way I grew up saying it is La Jablesse.
Hmm.
But I hadn't seen it written until much later in life, which actually is La Diablesse, which is French, correct?
It is,
Yeah.
but I still say La
Same.
Jablesse.
I can't say La Diablesse. That doesn't feel right to me. But so La Jablesse
Yeah.
is my family is Trinidadian. This is one that I grew up with. Let's talk about this story.
La Jablesse. Beautiful woman, usually depicted in a nice close fitting dress at the top, and then the skirt kind of fluffs out with this big beautiful floppy hat. And you often see her on the road with one foot on the road and one foot on the grass, and it's said that the foot on the road reveals a sexy luscious leg, and the other one is a cow hoof. And she's known, there's a story that's told for men who are out at night tend to get lured by beautiful women. She will lure them to her, and then suddenly they end up drifting off cliffs or they just disappear. That's how it goes.
And that the storytelling there, the lesson there is
Don't go out with strangers. Mind your P's and Q's. Like when you're out at night, don't drink yourself till you don't know you don't have sense.
yeah,
Like you have to keep yourself sharp.
yes. Don't get lured in that by that pretty woman, and
Right.
watch for that cow foot.
Exactly. No one ever gets to the cow foot. They are looking everywhere but the foot, right?
Okay, what is the origin of that one?
That one, again, I find is in Jamaica. We tell that story a lot, and there's so many different versions. So I would say that it's more Afro Caribbean in nature, but heavily influenced. We have heavy influences from the Indian and South Asian backgrounds. The way the story is told when they describe the woman, and that spirituality that's inserted into the story, it's a combination of both. There are a lot of stories that we tell that are a combination of that African heritage and that South Asian heritage coming marrying together in a story.
Why then a name that sounds French, La Diablesse?
Okay, so the reason would be because of colonization and who was around at the time, because a lot of the stories that we told were for fortitude for the people during the time, and the stories that we often talk about are really overcoming the oppressor, or lessons to not just the grown-ups but for children as well. And so at the time, it could be that the French were in rule at that time. Just like a lot, you'll hear a lot of Spanish, you'll hear a lot of French, and that European influence, that Christianity. But it's inserted into the stories. It's because of who was colonizing the this space, the island, at the time that the story started to spread, or the time the story was changed from its original.
As you're just describing that, it is sort of, in a nutshell, what the culture is like in different Caribbean countries, depending on who was brought there, who colonized and stayed for a very long time, shifted and shaped the culture to what it is today, which is why every single country has this slightly different makeup, has slightly different versions of the food. And what I call callaloo might not be the same as another country, but it's all sort of intermingled and intermixed in a different way, which is why we each have a commonality in our cultures and there are differences in our cultures.
Yes, that's why we're such a beautiful people. It's on every level.
It is on every level and in everything. I'm going to talk about duppy because you also mentioned that one. So anybody who doesn't understand what a duppy is, what is
So
it?
a duppy is a malevolent spirit, a ghost. They're mischievous. So it's said, I'll put it this way, it's said that when you pass away, or someone you know passes away, that there's the good spirit and there's the not so good spirit. Now in Jamaica, we tell people that for 3 days, your spirit walks the earth. And in that 3 day time, you have some decisions to make. And the good part of you goes off into the ever after, whatever that looks like for you. But if you have some things that are undone, some things that need to be taken care of, that not so great side of yourself will stay to complete those things. And if they're not completed, you can end up staying for a long period of time and attached to things. If you are there is some injustice, and what remains of that injustice is some type of bounty. For example, this cup, just giving you an example, your spirit could attach to that thing. So every person who ends up with this item, you know, has some experiences along as it is in their ownership. But that's when we have our Dumpy Conqueror stories, where we tell you how to conquer the not so great Duppies and what they do. But the stories keep you inside when they need to,
Mm.
and they give you curious in other cases.
Where would you find the duppy? Is it's not in every single country.
Yes, just by different names. For example, the cotton tree in Jamaica, we say, okay, don't play under there because that's where the spirits hang out. That's where the spirits are pulled. It's like a portal there. But Jumbi tree, say, is in Trinidad.
Mm,
Same thing, just different names. So
def-
zombies, dopey, ghosts in North America, they're the same, and you've got the good and the not so good, and it just depends on the flair or that cultural experience that gets added to the story to change it to what it needs to be resonate with the people from that area. So it's everywhere.
it's everywhere just by a different name.
Yes.
Um, a lot of these characters, when you mentioned Jumbie, we're recording this in January, and Carnival is on my mind. So there, that comes out into some of the characters and the costumes
Yep.
that are shown in Carnival, right?
Yes. There are certain experiences that we have where we dress up, and now the dressing up is a little less dressing up than it used to be, but the theme is still there. That underlying foundation is still present. And the parades are really, for example, an expression of freedom, that defiance, that overcoming of the oppressor is still evident in the way that we do carnival. But there are different characters that appear in, I'm going to say different forms just because we're generations removed, that still exist. Like there's still the characters that seem to be representative of oppressors. There are characters of that freedom, that zealous, that religiousness. My mind is on Jakuno just because Christmas just passed,
Hmm.
and so we've got those characters where we've got the woman pregnant, we've got the cowhead, we've got, so those are the characters that are standing out in my mind now. But then, we also cover our skin like in oil, that to that second step or third step of defiance, that we're here, and yes, this is rich for you, but it's also a purest example of my freedom. Now we're still exhibiting in everything that we do, and even though we're now removed and the costumes are changed, but now look at the colors, look at the way we're presenting them. It's still putting us on the street, feet on the ground, celebrating our defiance, showcasing our music. This is our freedom. We're here. And when we come out at Carnival, we come out as a mass.
And you will see everybody of every age, every background on the road.
Yes.
Yes. We've talked about a couple of different characters. Are there any that are not quite so scary?
Of course.
Because the ones we've talked about are a little bit, they instill a little bit of fear, right? They're telling you a lesson. They're sort of warning you against something. But I can't think of one from my childhood that is not scary.
Really? Oh, okay. So we've got the Anansi trickster stories. We've got Coprin Le Pen, who's another type of funny hee haw character. But then a lot of those stories, they interact with others. For example, Toad and Donkey. The story of Toad and Donkey in Jamaica is similar to the tortoise and the hare. And I tell the stories together on purpose to see who picks up on it. I also tell the different versions of the hare and the tortoise, and I have, what? That's not how the story goes. But how do you know? Were you there? So I like to kind of play with them with it that way by showcasing these characters who are not always scary. And no, they're not always big or they're not a tiny spider, but they've got to use that cleverness to overcome their challenge in the same way. So I do dabble with the different characters. And sometimes what I love is that a lot of our characters are animals and they have human characteristics. So you can now play on social issues when you're telling your story. Instead of it having to be a black and a white person, now you can have a hen and a hawk. And it's like, but they're both birds. Ah, so you get it now. And so when you're able to play with the characters, you help people to see their situations a little bit differently. So that's why there's so much power in the characters that may not be so scary, but the ones that are, they have their place too.
Yeah. Before we wrap, I want to ask the question about religion
Mhm.
and folklore. For me, a
Mhm.
lot of the folklore seemed to be attributed to Obia. And Obia, while stems from a religion, depending on who you talk to, people don't believe it to be? And this is a whole other conversation, but let's talk about that.
It is. So, like I said, the stories that we've been passing down for generations, they give a little bit of insight on who we are. So, it's our traditions and definitely our religion. And when you listen to the stories, depending on what ear you're using or what lens, let's say, you'll recognize certain things. So, yes, definitely Obia, but Santeria, voodoo, it's all kind of dabbled in there, and it's a nod to that witchcraft pieces. But then you also have to look at the influences in the Hindu religion. Christianity, you'll find that some of the stories are now Bible verses. You'll catch some versions that have the Bible verses. You'll catch some that have that instead of that evil and good, they're now fluffy, might not be the best word. But they've softened. I've noticed that a lot of the stories now that I tell, I can't always say so and so died. It depends on the audience. So I can tell an original, which is just generations removed, or I have to tell a newer version where the ending is more vague and you don't share them. Some of the time you have to gloss over those areas that are heavy in
Right.
the religion, just because not everyone understands, especially when you're talking about Obia. Everyone's like, oh, it's evil, it's bad. And it's like,
Right.
that's a whole different conversation where we gotta, reprogram your thinking on this beautiful religion
Yeah.
and, help you with clarification, help you with an understanding. But the stories also keep you curious so that you're asking more and wanting to find out more about what makes up your religion, what makes you who you are.
When it comes to something like if an owl flies over your house, then somebody's going to die. That sentiment. Is that folklore?
Yes. So folklore is so many different pieces. There's the stories themselves, it's the ceremonies, it's the telling of the tales in the way that they're told, with the music and the chanting and the proverbs. These are the things that were beliefs, and when you track them back, the indigenous people have similar beliefs which are still relevant in the proverbs and the stories that we tell. So it was passed down through the generations, through the stories we tell. The indigenous people, storytelling was a big part of their ceremonies, and so it just keeps coming, keeps evolving, and coming forward into the next generation.
And as you talked about earlier in the conversation, is the indigenous people, there was a lot of nature involved in their storytelling. And I don't know, I'm going to say I don't know if I said that correctly. Is it if an owl passes over your house, somebody will die?
There are different versions depending on which island you're from and where you live. So that version is probably correct depending on where you're from.
Don't come for me if I was wrong. I'm trying to remember. Okay, I want to mention that you do have a podcast where you tell some of these stories. What's it
I
called?
do. My podcast is called Walk Good. And the premise behind it is to bring back those stories, sharing it with everyone in the diaspora, everyone from the Caribbean, just to put a bug in your ear. Remember these stories, remember this chant. And so I don't really go into a discussion. I really just share the story in my own special way, and then I leave it for you to continue that conversation with your families. And so when I wrap, I always say, share the story with a friend and come back for the next one, because that's what we do. That's what stories are meant for. They're meant to be put out, and the
Yeah.
person who receives it should share it.
I'm going to leave a link to your podcast and your website in the show notes so people can connect with you and see what you're up to. And we're going to wrap for today, but we're going to come back in another episode to talk about a story that we already mentioned today, the
Awesome.
trickster, in the version that you want to tell it. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you soon.
Oh, you're welcome. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Moreish Podcast. Connect with us on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at the Moreish Podcast. see you for the next episode.